All right. Well, it's 12:03, so I'm declaring we've got the 3-minute rule to go ahead and get started. So let me kick things off. All right. So it's my pleasure today to be your moderator. I'm Kevin Fu from Northeastern University and the director of the Archimedes Center for Healthcare and Medical Device Cybersecurity. This is the joint Archimedes UCSF-Stanford CERSI seminar series on medical device security. And today we're going to have what I think will be a fun and lively panel. We've been alternating between plenary speakers and panels. Today, we're going to have a panel on some noted experts from the medical device community on the use of software bill of materials and demystifying medical device software bill of materials. We'll be talking about challenges and best practices for manufacturers and healthcare providers. Though admittedly today it's going to have more of a manufacturing viewpoint, and looking forward to down the line, including healthcare provider inputs and perspectives as well. Before we get into the meat of today's webinar, just a couple administrative points. If you are an attendee, you should see you have, there's no chat button because of the size of the seminar. However, we have a Q&A button. So if you would like to submit a question for consideration, you are welcome to go down to the Q&A function to submit a question for consideration. We typically are not able to get to all questions, but feel free to submit and we'll consider that request. But as we get started today, what I'd like to first do is introduce each of our panelists. And so today I'm pleased to have five panelists joining me. And we'll begin alphabetically. So we'll begin with Matt Hazlett from MedSec. Matt previously was at the Food and Drug Administration. And Matt, if you don't mind giving a moment to introduce yourself.
Sure, happy to be here. I'm Matt Hazlett. I'm the COO and CQO here at MedSec. We do some medical device cybersecurity consulting and services, technical services. I most recently, prior to joining MedSec in July, was at FDA doing a lot of cybersecurity policy work and implementation. So a lot of work on the 2023 pre-market cybersecurity guidance, as well as the work on the 524B implementation and working with training and review staff on how to approach cybersecurity reviews, both pre and post-market.
Great. Thanks for joining us, Matt. And Sanharya from Vapotherm and one of the earliest Archimedes members. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Happy to be here. So my name is Soundarya Nagasubramanian. I'm VP of Connectivity, Data Management, and Security at Vapotherm. Vapotherm is a respiratory care solution company, so medical device manufacturer. We make high velocity therapy solutions that help with patients both in the hospital and in the home. Before this, I was with Baxter, working as a director of product security. So I've been in the product security for the last decade. It's been a fun journey so far, and I'm excited to be here to discuss SBOMs.
Hey, thanks for joining. David Nathans. David is with Siemens Healthineers, and he's also a Northeastern University alum. But welcome to the panel, and would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Dave Nathans, CISO for the Americas, Siemens Healthineers. And one of my core responsibilities is really taking the voice of the customer from a cybersecurity perspective and ensuring that it has broad adoptions across our many different divisions that are developing medical devices for hospitals across the world.
Thank you, David. Well, let's turn to Chris Reed from Medtronic, and certainly the snappiest and has the best artwork, which I believe is an actual real background, correct?
It is a real background. My wife is an artist, so that is her work that I get. It usually changes out more. I have it all over the house, which is it's good to be married to an artist. You get lots of great artwork. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so and by the way, I don't normally dress like this. I have a interesting meeting soon after this with um, the House Energy and Commerce Committee. So I don't normally dress like this, but I will do that for them. Um, so I'm a senior director of cybersecurity policy. I actually sit inside of regulatory right now. I spend about half my time trying to shape what good looks like policy-wise, standards on the outside, and then I spend the other half of my time kind of trying to get our regulatory teams ready to be successful with the FDA, our R&D teams, like what are making sure our policies reflect the right, what good looks like. I have over 25 years of cybersecurity experience, been in medical devices now for 10 years. I've worked in lots of different roles. I've done R&D work on an insulin pump that's actually on the market. And so I have like the depth like that. But I also have spent a lot of time on policy and things too. So really my goal is to how do we raise the tide for everyone. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation today.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And Axel Worth from MedCrypt, and welcome to the program. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, thanks, Kevin. So Axel Worth, I'm the Chief Security Strategist at MedCrypt, a company focused on cybersecurity technologies, tools, and services for medical device manufacturers. I have been in cybersecurity with focus on the healthcare industry for 17 years now. And prior to that, I spent a couple of decades actually in the industry, imaging, diagnostics, monitoring, PACS. So I've been kind of around the block and kind of have seen it all.
All right. Well, welcome to the program. And I've hand selected these fine individuals. The reason I think for this panel is number one, software bill of materials is one of the while it's an old concept, it's relatively new to the medical device community. The joke I have to say is we did a survey of biomedical engineers, and I believe it was something like 60% of them couldn't spell SBOM. So there's definitely variance in understanding of SBOM, its existence, and then also for those who are more on the expert side, how to use it effectively for better cybersecurity. So I want to set the context with my memory of SBOM. There are a number of individuals, I think, who really led this early development. I recall there was an Archimedes meeting about 10 years ago where I believe it was Michael McNeil. I don't know if you're in the audience, Michael, but I believe Michael was in the back of the room, and we were talking about priorities for the community, and he said, "We need a software bill of materials." And at this point, I'm expecting Michael to come out of the background and say yes. And this was a new concept back then, right? Where the concept of the nutritional equivalent to an ingredients list started to take off. And of course, there were others. I Am the Cavalry, Josh and Bo, and others quite instrumental in moving this forward. Today, of course, we have not only regulatory guidance that refers to software bill of materials at the FDA CDRH, but we also have statute with Section 524B. And again, I know our attendees probably have a wide range, ranging from perhaps you're just trying to figure out what is SBOM, which is a totally acceptable question, or maybe you've been tasked to, say, carrying out SBOM development within a company, or maybe ingesting it within an HDO. So I'm expecting us to have just a wide range of experiences, hopes and fears. But I think I want to begin with just with each of our panelists. And I think what we'll do is we'll work backwards. So starting with Axel and then working backwards alphabetically. Just begin with, is there any perspective you'd like to share on where we stand with software bill of materials, whether it's adoption or whether it's regulatory? Any thoughts you'd like to start off with to seed the conversation? So Axel, we'll begin with you.
So I think if you look at adoption and maturity, we need to differentiate the different use cases. There's an obvious, what you may want to call a pre-market use case, right? Using SBOM to build more secure products, right? Be more aware of the vulnerabilities in your product. I think we are maturing quite nicely. That's the collective, we, the industry, in that area. Second use case is SBOM as documentation as part of your regulatory submission. Convince a market approving authority that you have done your job in building a secure product. I think we're getting there. I think that's another area that is relative nicely developing and evolving. Then you get to post-market management. I think we have a few more challenges there. We're not quite as mature, but I think what we need to do and what we need to learn how to do better is well defined. Not going to get lost into detail here. And then the fourth use case, I think, is use of SBOM by the device customer / operator / maintainer. And I think that is, of all the use cases, the least mature. I think that is the one where we, and again, that's the collective, we as an industry, need to spend quite some time to make sure we define the right processes, the right standards, and the right practices on how hospitals, how clinical engineers in hospitals can utilize SBOM to do a better job in maintaining their asset inventory.
Right. So that's certainly going to be, I think, the elephant in the room. The HDO use cases. I would agree. The manufacturer side is a little bit more, I think, mature. So maybe we should turn to a manufacturer and alphabetically. I think Chris Reed. We're gonna put you on the spot there, but just any thoughts you have about where we stand with SBOM and whether it's on behalf of manufacturers or whether it's what you're seeing with some of your health delivery organization customers.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I'd first just start out to say that I'm definitely a big proponent and fan of SBOMs. But I would also caution us that, first of all, it's not the silver bullet that solves all problems. And secondly, we are very early in this journey. And I think the points I would make on that are, I think we're basically at a crawl right now. Medical devices are one of the industries that is regulated to require it, which I think is good. It's helped us move faster into that maturity, to start that maturity process. But I say we're crawling because there's just still a lot of details that really prevent us from getting to I think what the ultimate goal of some of this is, which is helping us automate and find issues and manage issues. I think what we have gotten to is a level of transparency, which I think is super important. And the one point I'd like to make is it's transparency with objective data. Like if the software's in your product, it is or it isn't, and then you can get into whether or not that's a problem, right? But I think there's some really great conversations that it's supporting, like with our regulatory authorities, like FDA, as well as with our customers. But right now, I would say it's really a manual process. It's more like it's a tool that helps indicate maturity and prompt some questions. But there's a lot of problems with the data and integration and the way practices are happening around vulnerabilities that make it difficult to scale to some automated tool that helps us manage risk more effectively. So I think we're crawling in that journey. I think it's been a helpful tool, but we have a long runway ahead of us on how to really mature this practice and make it truly scale to the level that we need to ultimately.
And of course, in scaling as well, not just for internally, but also for regulatory review, of course, many use cases. So working around our panelists here, I think we'll turn to David Nathans. Your thoughts on SBOM or topics you'd like to raise today?
Sure. I mean, I think I echo a lot of the same sentiments that Chris already mentioned. But I think I'd also like to add, I mean, having regulated devices for, many years, the actual practice of SBOM really isn't new, right? We're required to know what goes into our products. We're required to know how they operate, right? How they're performing clinical functionality. We have to do a lot of verification and validation exercises. So it's not essentially a new practice in any stretch of the imagination. What's new is how we're actually taking that data and then making it consumable and usable for the cyber effort. And for us, it's really baked into our processes from the very beginning. So we're not, using, SBOM tools as an afterthought. It's how we're actually doing the monitoring of the software components in our products from the onset. So if there's a piece of software that's in our product, we have to monitor it. And really, the exercise now for us is how is the customer, how are the healthcare delivery organizations going to consume that information, and how do we provide that information in a meaningful way, not just to customers, but also to our regulators. And then when things are found out in those SBOMs, there's a vulnerability that's detected because the SBOM says that we've got a vulnerable piece of software. How do we effectively answer that? So, is it that we've evaluated it and the risk is not there because the functionality is not there? Is it something that, is patched and we've already provided an update and you don't have the new updated SBOM data? Right? Those are some of the operational challenges that I think we're all really facing is, it's paralysis through analysis. There's just so much data. How do you keep it up to date? How do you keep it live? And then how do you effectively communicate the risks inside of those SBOMs if there are risks? So I see some of those as really the challenges. And, again, if you look at your average hospital that might have 90,000 medical devices, now they have 90,000 SBOMs that could be 100 pages long. How are they consuming that information in an effective way to be able to evaluate risk? And, I think that's really what is emerging. I think that's why we're having these conversations. And, how do we produce that data?
Right. And certainly printouts of SBOMs are probably the least desirable way for an HDO to ingest, but I can imagine worse. But yeah. Well, thanks for those comments, David. Why don't we turn to Sanharya? And Sanharya has been working on some interesting products over the years. Has loved to hear your perspective on software bill of materials and what you're hearing.
Sure. I mean, I'm totally aligned with Chris and David in a lot of the issues they brought up. I agree that SBOM generation is probably one of the more mature areas, right? And especially pre-market. I still think that post-market is not as, up to pace as it is with the pre-market. And some of the execution problems that David was talking about are kind of the reason, right? So, I mean, not only must everyone keep track of SBOMs, the SBOMs change per version of software. So now you've got legacy devices with, if you have 10 versions, you have 10 SBOMs at a minimum. So there's a scaling problem there. And then the automation of how you can manage this, I think is still more in the crawl type of area. I think generation is more in the walk, but the management and post-market is more in the crawl. And the other thing is, if there's a zero-day vulnerability, speed is of essence, right? You got to figure out quickly which products are impacted. And I think that's where this automation and analysis could be beneficial. Still takes a while to figure out, even if you have the component, how much of risk there is to each product or each product software version, right? And then being able to communicate it. So those are areas I feel that are still, kind of in the crawl area and have to mature. But certainly in the last few years, at least the generation part has picked up some level of momentum because of the use cases, with sharing it with customers and regulatory.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the HDOs using it, it is still very much in the crawl space because, like I think David pointed out, there's a huge number of products that each hospital has to manage and equal number of SBOMs, not to mention the software versions.
Right, right. And on that walk and crawl, that maybe this is a good segue to Matt. at least what I teach my students, many of whom are on the call, this is part of their homework assignment, learning about SBOMs today, is that the perfect is the enemy of the good, or the perfect is the enemy of the done. So, Matt, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on SBOM, but also I know you have a lot of insight on, completeness versus useful. But any thoughts you have you'd like to start off seeding our conversations here?
I'd say SBOM was always going to be and is proving to be a maturity journey. Much as others have said, we're kind of more at the crawl phase in a number of the different use cases that Axel laid out. Definitely once manufacturers are providing SBOMs to hospitals, that's kind of far out from maximizing the utilization and truly operationalizing the benefits that the SBOM promise is kind of ingrained within. So we're definitely early in those phases. We're getting more specificity as the now new version of the CISA framing document has come out. We're getting greater clarity on kind of what different levels of good mean for the complexity and the level of information that's being provided. And from the regulatory submission landscape, both to get your device onto market and to keep your device on market as you're making changes, regulators are going to evolve their practices. So right now it's very much do you have it? Does it have all the elements? Does the elements you're providing align with your software architecture diagrams? And over time, there's going to be an increased focus on expecting greater depth because the supply chains are going to start to better accommodate getting better SBOMs for components. Manufacturers will be better at being able to generate and maintain SBOM information at greater depths. And regulators will continue to look deeper at those details and get better capabilities for making some of those assessments to make better decisions for authorizing products with that. So I'd say definitely we're early in this process. We had to start somewhere. I'd say it was a surprise at how big of a challenge this was because configuration management is nothing new, as David said. So I don't think there was an expectation that this would be as hard of a problem to solve as it has evolved into, but there's definitely progress being made.
And I suppose there's all sorts of tongue-in-cheek ways to describe SBOM. There's a great bookstore in Massachusetts called the Book Mill, and their tagline is "Books you don't need in a place you can't find." But I'm imagining with SBOMs we'll be having a lot of software we don't need on these medical devices, and sometimes we can't even find the patches. So opening up to the panel. For just discussion, I want to go through challenges and then talk about a little bit of practical implementation. But one of the things I have to imagine many of the people joining as attendees today are probably from the manufacturing community, and they've probably done a run-of-the-mill SBOM and just realized, oh my gosh, we have thousands of packages and thousands of CVEs or common vulnerability. A bunch of security vulnerabilities in here. Oh my God, is that the end of the world? Panelists, love to hear your thoughts on for an attendee who's just wading in for the first time. Maybe they're doing their most recent 510K or PMA, and they're starting to do SBOM, and they start to discover all these vulnerabilities. Should they be worrying? What should be on their mind?
I mean, I can jump in. I think they shouldn't be worried, right? They should know what's in the product. But you made a really interesting point, Kevin, about all these things that are in the products, and you might find things that maybe you don't need. So, are you looking at SBOM as maybe a software diet program, right? Things that you maybe don't need anymore and you can reduce. I think one of the challenges that we all face is that when you install a software component, it might have any number of cascading dependencies. You don't necessarily need that on there, but you can't divorce that core component from dependencies. And that becomes the challenge. And I think that's also some of the risk, right? Because you have all these things that might exist on a platform and you don't have a choice. You're forced to eat it. So what are those dependencies? And then are you now in a situation where you have to defend a subcomponent or a dependency component that you don't even use that may have a vulnerability, but you can't necessarily replace because the source or the vendor that you got that software component from hasn't updated their core component, and you can't just pull it out and you can't upgrade it. So I think that's some of the challenges. I think from an awareness perspective, it's great. Certainly I like the software diet, component. Do you really need that on there? And you should be doing some, software composition analysis to determine those things, but you start to go down a pretty significant rabbit hole. So I would throw that out there as the challenge, and what manufacturers really need to think about, how far you're going to chase it.
Yeah. Maybe Kevin, the thing I love that you pointed out that I think sometimes in the simplistic views of these things doesn't get emphasized enough is there are lots of vulnerabilities in software. Very few of them are actually exploitable, and that's not an excuse, but that's how do we use this data to help us prioritize and focus on the right problems and not get caught up on a hamster wheel of just trying to keep up? There are a couple points I want to make out of that. I do love SBOM because it's the lowest common denominator of how we can communicate objective information. The downside of it is kind of like what David said, it doesn't show you whether or not the system's actually vulnerable. And in fact, a lot of medical devices have added a lot of layers to keep their products resilient, because they know they can't patch every month, right? So it's a good objective piece of data, but it's by itself, it doesn't necessarily tell you whether or not a device is secure. However, it will tell you a little bit of the diet thing. If someone's never updating their software, and it's clear in the SBOM, that clearly shows you that maybe that vendor needs some help, right? I think the biggest thing I've seen, you mentioned the submission process, making it clear that one thing we worked on even with the Patch Act or 524B is the idea that we need to do maintenance on our products. There's a reasonably regular cycle. And so the SBOM becomes that moment of truth. If you're on a Windows system and you haven't applied the latest consolidated update and you're doing a submission, you're probably going to get called out for that, right? If you're not doing that maintenance work. But at the same time, to think that you're going to be vulnerability free, like what we need to ensure is that we're free of vulnerabilities that are exploitable and can cause risk to either the environments they operate in or the devices themselves. So I think, but using objective data to do that is really important, but we got to realize the SBOM by itself does not answer all the questions, which is the maturity part of this.
Right.
Yeah, to your point, the mitigating controls or the layers that are on top of it, you don't come out necessarily in the SBOM. So you don't know what security controls are in the product that might be there to prevent those exact use cases.
Yeah. I think that, that's where the magic is, right? So to answer the question, no, you should expect that there will be vulnerabilities, right? When you're using software, how can there not be vulnerabilities? So it's kind of an expected thing to see those. So the magic is, and you have enough of an understanding of the architecture. And so you are able to say which components, which vulnerabilities are going to cause risk and can be exploited. And those are the ones that you should mitigate. I also think that the diet point is a great one because it forces you to say, hey, do I really want to have so much to look at? Or can I thin it down so that I don't have that volume? What is needed can be taken out, right? So then your volume of what you have to evaluate comes down. So it forces that conversation. And I also think that in some cases, software development teams, when they start the journey of development, use more than what's needed because they don't know what they need, right? So when you come to the end and you generate an SBOM, sometimes it's a surprise, like you have so many components that you actually don't need. And so taking them out simplifies your SBOM, makes life simpler overall for everyone, because now you don't have vulnerabilities you have to worry about, even to evaluate, right? So I think that is, again, sort of maturity of the team, of the product, of the organization, right? A lot of it comes into play. But, seeing a lot of vulnerabilities is not, kind of unexpected. It should be an expected outcome. More of how do you manage them? Do you have the right architecture and understanding of the product so that you can wade through them and decide what is it that you have to worry about?
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from all this discussion is that vulnerabilities are a normal part of life when it comes to managing complicated software. But Sanhari, as you described, like removing components can simplify that. I have to say, like, as a previous engineer at a big IT company, it's certainly easier just to say cp-pr, copy recursively all files. Put the entire Linux kernel on there with every single interface. That's certainly the fewest number of command line actions you have to take, but creates all that liability. Of course, the tools are still maturing. Again, we have some people in the medical device community who are just getting their feet wet, and this is totally normal. And you'll try running the tools, and some of them might not even compile, might not even work. Others will produce more sensible data, and they're all maturing. So I'm curious about, as we look more toward simplifying code bases so that it's easier to evaluate, easier to reason about safety, what are things going to look like? But also, I think it'd be interesting to hear perspectives on the underlying current of IT versus OT, because I always feel like that's the elephant in the room. And again, acronym soup. Information technology, I think most people know what IT is. It's your standard software. But OT, not everybody knows what that is, operational technology. And through the OT lens, you'll probably make different decisions, more risk management based decisions. Whereas the IT lens, when we teach IT security in a university, we say control all the risks, implement all the controls. But if you're an OT, you would never do that. So, and of course, this is intertwined with SBOM. Thoughts from the panel on any of these issues of IT versus OT or maturity of tools?
Well, there's a number of important differences there, including the level of control you have as the operator and maintainer. Right? If you are running an IT infrastructure, you buy the individual software packages, you can patch them at will, you can implement security controls at will. Whereas if you operate in an OT environment, doesn't matter whether it's industrial control systems or medical devices, you're always dependent on the manufacturer of those devices to provide the patches because they're proprietary, to authorize the patches because the software is regulated, and so forth. So that different relationship and level of control over what you are trying to secure is, I think, one of the significant differences between IT and OT. And yes, SBOM helps to create transparency, but with the challenges we discussed. It's a tool, but it's not the final answer. I think it's a step in the right direction, but it's not the last step.
Another way that I might interpret that thinking would be is there are certain SBOM extreme transgressions where there's an obvious extreme violation of some kind of security property, and there's others that are gray area. A potentially extreme situation might be just deploying outdated software that has no patchability or that maybe lost maintenance 10 years ago. To me, that is probably in the extreme category. Maybe some of the panelists disagree with me. Or you have to go check your SBOMs.
No,
But
I would disagree only in the sense that just because it's out of date doesn't mean it's vulnerable.
oh,
It
I'm
may
sorry.
still be, just
Only
because
that.
it's out of date does not mean that it's vulnerable,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's a lot of old software that's not vulnerable and it's still viable,
Mm-hmm.
right? It doesn't mean that you shouldn't monitor it, and doesn't mean that you shouldn't have, mitigating or compensating controls for old software, but just because something goes, old doesn't mean that it's not usable. So I think do have to be a little careful, right? You have to evaluate it. You have to understand it.
David was typing his SBOMs at that very moment just to check running 10-year-old's Windows.
No,
But in
because
seriousness,
we have this argument a lot, right? So you might find a component, on GitHub somewhere, right? And then it becomes an abandoned, repo, and so that is essentially the end of life of the software unless you fork it and maintain it yourself. You might not necessarily perform any updates on it. It might be completely viable software. It just doesn't mean that it's vulnerable, right? Just because it's old doesn't mean it's bad. I hope not, because I'm a pretty old person and I'm not bad.
right.
Yeah.
So I I want to pull out one of the words you used, David, and that is controlled.
Mhm.
And I want to open this up to the rest of the panel too. For there may be some attendees who are not quite familiar with the nuance of what does it mean to be a controlled vulnerability. So give a chance to our other panelists to chime in as well on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important distinction in our space. First of all, just go back to the law. We worked really, really hard to construct that in a way that was actually both helpful and practical. So in the FDA's language, uncontrolled means you have some type of safety risk or unacceptable risk. And that doesn't just mean for the device's operation, that could mean for the environment it's operating in. So even if it was going to be something that perpetuated ransomware, that's not a controlled risk, right? I think I would emphasize that. But as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of times where you have mitigating controls. So even though that vulnerability is technically there in the software, like it's controlled, meaning that there's no real exploitability path to that. And therefore, those should want, so if you are uncontrolled, the way the law is written, you have to respond quickly and appropriately to manage that risk. But the other part of the law is that, you then do your maintenance work on some basis, and I think that's the key here is how do we get into managing our overall debt? I think I will just acknowledge that I do think medical devices are adding more and more software, and they traditionally were hardware devices where you mastered that hardware and then you reproduced it millions of times and sold it. And it didn't change for years. Software changes so fast, and I think manufacturers and are still catching up to that. And like, what are those maintenance cycles that should be in place? And it's not just for the manufacturer, because a lot of times that passes work down to the HDOs because they have to take something down for downtime and get the update applied. Like this is a capacity management problem as well as a risk problem, right? That we need to manage through the ecosystem. The other thing I want to come back to a little bit, you were talking about IT versus OT, and that we apply everything in the IT space. Let's be real that like all these vulnerabilities exist in the IT systems too. If anyone's ever worked enterprise IT, there are thousands of vulnerabilities all through the IT environment. So no one has, this is a hard problem. If you go out and just go query Google or LinkedIn or watch the feed on people talking about vulnerabilities. There's EPSS trying to prioritize which vulnerabilities the IT environments are going to fix. Like this is a problem for everyone, OT and IT, but there are, Kevin, some unique aspects to OT versus IT that need to be thought through for sure.
Including the aspect of harm, right? The level of harm you can do in the IT space is generally lower and limited to the business, whereas in the OT space, you can do physical harm. That's another important differentiator.
And by the way, physical harm, not just because you don't have the update, because you're trying to get the update done. Like change on OT devices,
It's
like
higher risk, yeah.
It's higher risk anytime you touch the devices, right? So I'm not saying there's no risk on the IT side, but there's a lot more thought and process that needs to go. I mean, I've heard, I don't work for an HDO, but I've heard HDOs that talk about the work they have to do to verify or validate that the systems operate clinically still performing adequately every time they touch the device, right? And that's a workload, and it's important they do that, right? Because you don't want them to go in and dial something into a drug delivery pump and find out it's not working correctly, because even though the patch didn't apply quite right, and so it's, even though the patch was correct, it didn't get applied right, and therefore it's now misdosing some drug. Like, that would be tragic, right? So it is a tough problem to manage.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that workload issue is real, especially when, you know, we look at the cyber landscape and there really isn't enough people to handle this issue. So I see a lot of organizations that are applying IT mindset to the OT environment, and that's dangerous, right? They feel as though it's a square peg in a square hole, and it all should look the same, but it isn't, right? You have to apply the right controls to that OT environment, and sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. And if you're just, you know, saying, hey, you know, I want my medical devices updated every, you know, 30 days, or I want the updates to come as they're available from the software vendor, you know, that's a hard thing for a hospital to actually accomplish operationally. Forget the manufacturer. I mean, if you want to update those devices consistently on a daily basis, then you don't have a hospital anymore, right? Those devices are not, they're not functioning as a medical device anymore. They're just sitting there getting updates. And you
I mean,
can't,
Yeah.
I
you
think
Sorry.
there's
Oh,
something to
device,
be said for the
you know, for clinical purpose,
rapid
and you know,
evolution that we've had in the medical device development sector. So we started from devices that were very hardware based to devices that started including software, but it was embedded with custom code that manufacturers developed, to now leveraging more commercial technologies, more third-party software components, cloud software architectures. So we've had an exponential growth of some of these risk factors, and now we're trying to get a handle of it. So the SBOM is really one of these risk management tools to help surface some of these risks and help manufacturers make better decisions of how they can not have to require their devices to be updated as frequently if they're removing components that are more vulnerable or have more vulnerabilities and susceptibility or access to be able to exploit those vulnerabilities. So I think we've been on a rapid evolution in the medical device space of where some of these cybersecurity risks are coming from, and we're trying to get the tools in place to help us better manage those.
so Sandhari, I think you had your hand raised. I want to make sure we turn to your comment here.
sure. Thank you, Kevin. I was just adding on to what we were talking about, the scale problem at the HDOs, because it's not only that you want the application of the software patch can take, you know, time, and we want the hospitals to be able to absorb that at the right pace. But the other aspect of it is training, right? Supposing your software patch or software update changes the behavior of the device, and the users don't understand how exactly to use it, now you've got a bigger risk. So this kind of goes to the problem of OT versus IT, right? And even with IT, you know, like we had CrowdStrike Falcon, right? Things even in the tools can impact it. So there's always a risk there. So I think overall, you know, I still look to the SBOM to be an evaluation tool first, right? You know, to kind of the simplification and containment of the problem, and then you can use it for, you know, managing the vulnerabilities, but definitely not the silver bullet.
So since we're starting to talk about HDOs, I want to give some deference to questions from HDOs. Since it seems like we have consensus that that's the area where the SBOM tools are the least mature. But there's a question that's on the periphery of SBOM. And so any panelists, feel free to chime in here or raise your hand if you'd like to be called on. And HDO is asking, is there an industry standard document or any kind of certification that can attest to whether a medical device manufacturer is complying with things such like the patch, well, what became 524B, or is this covered in a 510(k) summary document? I think there's a lot of nuance in this question, and it's on the periphery of SBOM. But is any advice you might like to give to a healthcare delivery organization as they're trying to figure out sort of the legitimacy of medical device manufacturer claims about cybersecurity?
Well, first of all, any recently approved device, by definition, has to meet what is spelled out in 524B and in the FDA pre-market guidance, and needs to have an actual post-market management program in place, right? However, that happened gradually over time. So if you go back to devices that were market approved a few years back, they don't have that level of maturity. But certainly, as an HDO, you can issue questionnaires and get answers from your vendors on certain security questions. You can include security clauses in your contracts, right, in your purchasing contracts. You can ask for security documentation, such as the MDS2, Manufacturer Disclosure Statement for Medical Device Security, that gives you an indication on, the basics of security designed into the device. And then lastly, you can ask for an SBOM, even if you're aware that you as an HDO organization cannot meaningfully consume the SBOM right now. But the fact that the manufacturer can or cannot produce an SBOM gives you also an indication of their maturity.
I'm curious from our manufacturers on the call if there's anything you can comment on when an HDO requests an SBOM, or what kind of processes are placed, or what can we see in the near future in that space?
Well, I think for Siemens Healthineers, it's pretty simple. We publish all of our SBOMs as well as a comprehensive IT security white paper in our centralized portal. So any of our customers that have authorization to that portal can go in. They can select the specific device and see all that documentation and download it in various formats. And that's available today.
Okay.
I think,
Yeah,
Kevin, on
go
our
ahead.
side, on our side, we don't have that kind of a centralized portal. But if the customers call the customer service, or as part of the sales negotiation, they request those documents, those are delivered to them. So it's more of a request and receive type of process, but we still make them available to our customers.
Okay.
Yeah, agreed. We make it available. I think the thing I would emphasize still, though, is I think it's a good objective source of information to start a conversation, but it's not the full picture. And that's what people need to be careful about. As you heard, there's lots of times where, there may be a vulnerability in something, but it's just no path to it. And the manufacturer may totally intend to fix that. There's also times where a manufacturer may need to be beat up for something. I can tell you I beat up my own teams. Kind of the diet point earlier. I've had teams that have made, and Kevin, you mentioned this, or actually with Matt, using consumer technologies in situations that don't make sense. I mean, I will flat out say that I've had teams using Android on certain devices and had no plan to how they were going to keep pace, even though the life cycle was way beyond what Android could ever, consumer cell phone devices move really fast. And in fact, I think it's 3 years and Android's out of date, right? If they aren't ready to keep up with those paces, they have no business using that consumer software and that solution, right? And I have seen changes because of that conversation. And so by no means does it mean everything's being done right, but ideally the SBOM gives you that factual data that you can start that conversation with and ask good questions and get some confidence that the manufacturer on the other side actually has their act together and that you're getting good answers. If they look at you and don't know how to answer the questions, I think that's a pretty sign of where they're at in their maturity.
And so segue from maturity to more about FDA interpretation of SBOMs and such. Panelists on the call have been on all sides of these kinds of conversations. And we have I think we have time for just one more question from the audience before we get into some closing statements. But we have one question about to what degree is the FDA, in your view, receptive to nuanced explanations of what's termed as non-exploitable vulnerabilities based upon company threat models, or I'm assuming based upon threat models and SBOMs. I'm imagining there'll be multiple types of responses here, but let me just throw that out there as red meat and see what happens.
I'll jump in there because I deal with this a lot, and then I'd love to hear others' thoughts, right? First of all, I welcome the question from the from the reviewer. Ideally, we've done a good job. I think there was a question in the thread about like how do you answer situations like that? And I think number one, you should already have answered that in your documentation. So ideally, you're not making up an answer. You're pointing them to where you've already assessed that and why it's reasonable. But I will tell you, there's clearly positions I would not want to defend, and I've told my teams that, and I've made them make changes because of that, right? So if I'm defending so imagine we have a Windows system inside of some device, and we finished development of it and started testing like back in October of last year. If I had all the Microsoft patches through October and then the system is resilient enough, our documentation will say, hey, at the end of our development, we put all the latest patches on, and then we have all these controls that let us wait until this frequency to come back and address those unless we see something that isn't addressed, right? That should be in our documentation. So when we get those questions, we should just be pointing the reviewer to where we've had that assessment. And I will say the FDA is I have not run into a situation yet. Sometimes it might take a couple rounds of discussion, but I think they're very reasonable and they should be. So I think that's the key is if you're just coming up with the answer to that when you get the question, you're probably already losing. And again, I've forced teams to go fix things because I'm like, you're not in a defensible position. You've never applied updates. You didn't apply like, come on, like that's not defensible, and I'm not even going to try it.
Where are my gold stars? Where are my gold stars?
I think that's the key point, Chris. You have to be able to defend your position, right? I mean, if you want to put it forward and you want to take that risk with the FDA, go for it. But you have to be able to defend it, and it's got to be, real. You can't just make it up, right? You have to do your due diligence, and if you're going to put forth a Windows XP machine for 510K today, be prepared to be shot down. You're not going to be able to defend it.
Yeah, my former FDA hat is just screaming at me to answer this question with "it depends," because it still hasn't left my body that's going to be the answer sometimes. But it's going to come down to what those rationales are, how believable that is. They're not just going to take a rationale at face value and accept it. They're gonna kick the tires and see if that actually resonates with them for what makes sense from a risk-based standpoint for the product, and also considering what the buildup of vulnerabilities are in the system. Essentially, if you think of vulnerabilities as rocks in the river and how you get across it, the more rocks you have, the easier it is to get across to some larger impact. So you want to be driving vulnerabilities out of the system, but they're going to weigh the totality of the information in front of them.
Yeah, in my experience, I've always found the FDA to be very willing to listen and work with us as manufacturers. I really don't um, envy their position because I think that they have a very hard line to go down, which is, protecting the patients and making sure the products are doing what they're supposed to be doing, but at the same time not stifling innovation. And I think that's really a key thing that we have to remember is that they want us as manufacturers to innovate and bring new things to market that cure patient illness. And how do we do that securely? And because of where we're at in the world of cybersecurity, we have to innovate, and they have to be flexible enough to allow us to innovate within reason as long as we can, to Chris's point, defend the position.
Right. And I think the other point there is that the proactiveness, right? There's so much there in terms of how you can be proactive. So if you are proactive and you're able to put forth your strategy in a defensible way, I do think that, you can get, the FDA is not going to be the gate that is not willing to work with you. So I don't think it's kind of like a black and white. It's more like, are you proactive? Do you have a defensible position? So those are the things that are going to be your friends when it comes to the submission.
So we're coming up on the end of the hour, and I want to give each panelist just it looks like we have 60 seconds for us, but just a few moments just to share. I wish we get all the questions, but some of your thoughts on what are you thinking about in the near term in the future for SBOM, and we'll have to conclude this discussion today, but we'll start there. So Sandhara, since maybe we'll start with you. Finalize any thoughts on what's on your mind for the near future.
Yeah, I think definitely the maturity thing and SBOMs would be a good thing when it comes to management of SBOMs and being able to scale and manage vulnerabilities. So we will definitely investigate that. And also, work with HDOs on how they would like to consume it. So I think those are kind of my immediate thoughts.
Right. Thanks for those thoughts. And Axel, how about we turn any of your thoughts on what's on your mind about SBOMs in the near-term future?
I think one problem we need to address is that the problem of the messiness of the data, right? The software component naming is not standardized. Vulnerability matching is not standardized. So if you take the hypothetical scenario that the manufacturer uses SBOM tool A, FDA uses SBOM tool B, and the hospital uses SBOM tool C, they will all three produce different results when they do the SBOM to vulnerability matching. Right? And then you need to go through a reconciliation effort on which actual result is correct. And you need to do that knowing that neither of the three is correct to begin with. Right? So that's, I think, a problem that needs to be addressed, and we need to understand how to work with.
Great. David, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that we're at the stage now where we're really looking past the SBOM. The SBOMs we know are going to create a tsunami. And so what do we do now that the SBOMs are out there and they are being consumed? How do we answer the questions that are going to come from that? So we're looking at things like VEX and different formats where we can answer a lot of these questions in mass. Or how do we leverage infrastructure that might be in place from a cyber perspective, different tools that are finding vulnerabilities or the different tools that are consuming SBOMs. How do we get our answers pre-populated into those platforms so that way their questions are being answered up front with minimal friction? So we're really looking in that direction.
Great. Chris?
Really not a lot to add other than a little detail. For Axel's, FDA sponsored a MITRE report on data normalization problems. So just so you know, we're not making it up. Go look up MITRE FDA SBOM data, and you should find the report from MITRE. It really does document a lot of what was talked about that we're working through. The second thing I love the VEX point. A lot of what we need to figure out is how do we improve our communication. We have an HSCC project where we're working on how do you combine SBOM with VEX and basically allow information to flow that eventually will enable automation, where you're not just trust us as the vendor. Like, yes, we have that vulnerability, but it's not exploitable. We should be able to say that somewhere, and you should be able to hold us accountable for that. And we should be able to flow that information to tools that allow it to calculate that and highlighting risks on the HDO side. That is the walking and maybe even running part, but we're working on like what should that data flow look like operationally.
Mm-hmm. And closing things out, Matt.
I'll go quick. Just say using these early lessons learned from surfacing SBOM information now to feed that into development cycles earlier to make better decisions around the components we're designing into software, and then looking towards as we start generating SBOMs of legacy devices, how are we going to manage that risk? That's going to get further surfaced.
All right. Well, I appreciate our panelists joining us today as we close things out. If you there are questions about getting copies of this material, although there are no slides today, you can find this at the UC San Francisco Stanford CERSI seminar website, or if you go to secure-medicine.org or contact us at archimedes@northeastern.edu, we'd be happy to point you in the right direction. Again, thank you all of our panelists, and I'd also like to thank Nathan Dang at UC San Francisco Stanford, as well as my students, including Christopher Pellegrini, who helped organize this, and Veronica Estrella and Yan Long. So thank you all for making this a great discussion, and I hope to have more of these in the future. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Goodbye, all.